Okay, so hello everybody, welcome to Hackney's event titled Partnership Approaches to Ending Violence Against Women and Girls in Hackney. My name is Captain Ryan, Service Manager within Hackney Children and Families Service. We have a panel today of agencies who work across the borough to address violence against women and girls in various forums. The panel will change procedure arrangements. We only have some people here now, and then 4 speakers will join the panel as we go on. So without further ado, I'll do a little bit of introduction. So we have Councillor Susan Janet Thomas, Cabinet Lead for Community Safety, Samantha Mathis, Lifetime Economy Manager, Morris Mason, Community Safety Partnerships Manager. Sorry?
Cannot hear you.
You can't hear you. It is very bad in this room. You have to shout, I think, if you can.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah, I must admit, it is bad for hearing in this room. Yeah.
And then
I need to be here because of the microphone. Yeah, probably if you want to come and sit here, that would be the best thing to do.
It's okay, if you just finish.
Yeah.
Okay, and then we have Detective Chief Inspector Azad Bashin from Metropolitan Service. So I will now hand over to Councillor Janet Thomas to do some opening remarks before we go to the rest of the panel. Thanks, Councillor.
Thanks very much, Kaha, not for today, but just for the work you were doing around Hackney or domestic abuse and intervention service. I think as cabinet lead for community safety that have responsibility for this area, I'm very proud of where Hackney is around our work, and in particular some of the area where we are leading. We're one of the leading councils when it comes to tackling violence against women and girls. Earlier on, we were at the town hall steps taking photo. We all know today is the beginning of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. This campaign is not just happening in Hackney and not just in the UK, it's happening around the world. So for people being here today, thanks very much for your effort. And to people that are listening at home, I know many people will be logging in to hear us from home. So thanks for making the effort. We all learn around statistics of women that are being abused or killed. And we look at them, these statistics are not just statistics. Behind the statistics are individuals, are families that are grieving for their loved ones. So it is important for us to see those women not as them, but as us. And today with this event, this special launch, we've got quite a number of partners that are supporting or that are here with us. So I thank people that are in this room and will be presenting today. Today you will hear from the community safety team, what they are doing. We know majority of assault, harassment that happens happens in our public spaces. We've got the community safety team. The nighttime economy manager will be giving us a short presentation around what Hackney is doing to keep women that are enjoyed our nightlife safe in Hackney. We're going to hear what we are doing in Hackney schools to make them safe spaces for girls to learn and develop. We're going to hear how domestic abuse is being addressed by the council and partner agencies. Also, as well as there will be feedback from people in the room, have the opportunity to ask questions that can be answered. But importantly, one thing that I want to say is, I mentioned earlier, I think in Hackney, if I get it right, 69% of assault harassment that happens in our public spaces have something to do with women. And because of that, as part of today, we're going to be launching a commonplace app or where we are inviting women in Hackney, not just women and girls. If there are areas where they feel uncomfortable walking or where they think, oh, that place is isolated, they might need a bit of lighting there. Oh, when I walk at that or alley, I feel like somebody is following me. That will belong to there. I think at the moment it's already on the website where people will be able to tell us, put a pin in anywhere they feel this way in our borough. And the reason for doing this is that as a council, we can go back and say, oh, people have said they don't feel comfortable walking on that street because of the poor lighting. Then what can we do to improve the lighting in the area? Or probably I feel followed when I walk through that alley. How do we or invite our partners as police officers, our enforcement officers to say, please, can you pay additional or attention to that area in terms of your enforcement, in terms of your patrol, so that you are visible there and women are more very comfortable in walking there. I think I've spoken too long, so that I can curate space for people who are meant to be presenting and talking to us about all what I've said. I will stop here. But again, I just want to say thank you for being with us today, either in the room or online. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Samantha Mathis. I'm, as Councillor mentioned, I'm Hackney's Nighttime Economy Manager. I work within the community safety and the business regulation teams, and I work mainly with licensed premises and the police towards building a safer nighttime economy for all. I also oversee all the Hackney Nights initiatives within the council. Next slide, please. So Hackney Nights was created in 2019, and it's the council's initiative to promote safety in the nighttime economy by combining public awareness campaigns with venue training, best practice guidance, and our new accreditation scheme. We will aim to deliver a cohesive safety strategy to Hackney's residents, workers, and visitors. And venues, clubs, and bars are important allies in the delivery of that strategy. And along with the police, our most important partners in tackling gender-based violence in the nighttime economy. The police are also holding an innovation hub next Thursday in Hackney alongside us to hear from experiences from young women and workers in the NTE and how we can adapt our approach to better protect women in public spaces and in our nighttime economy. Hearing young women's experiences are key in informing our strategy on tackling these issues. Next slide, please. So as part of some of the work undertaken around women's safety, Hackney teamed up with Good Night Out, an organization who has worked with the GLA and many other boroughs in the Women's Safety Charter to deliver training and an educational toolkit to improve understanding, response, and prevention of gender-based violence in nighttime spaces. They have already trained over 200 Hackney nightlife staff with no cost to businesses about sexual harassment and assault in sessions delivered in person and online during the pandemic. We hope to continue offering these sessions on a bi-monthly basis, with the hope that educating frontline staff will bring about some behavior changes in the NTE. Our new handbook, which will be distributed to all late night premises, will aim to answer important questions and empower individuals to report and intervene correctly when face-to-face with an incident in and around their venues. Another stakeholder we work with to provide training for venues is Safer Sounds Partnership, who just delivered a training this week in the town hall for nightlife staff, where they learned all about vulnerability and the Ask Angela campaign. More sessions are also planned in the new year. So the main training we offer is called Understanding and Responding to Sexual Harassment and Assault. It's a 2.5-hour session where participants will hear from sexual violence prevention trainers and take part in activities with a group of other nightlife workers and managers, supervisors, and others involved in Hackney's nightlife. So some of the top topics covered in the course are consent and the law, myth-busting sexual harassment and assault, ethical frameworks and best practice policies, responding to disclosures, enacting consequences, and supporting staff. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, yes, next slide. Yeah. Messaging and crime prevention is also an important part of the work we do. So this is just some examples of the campaigns we've rolled out under the Reframe the Night campaign. We partnered with City of London, so that was to raise awareness of sexual harassment and abuse in the nighttime economy, challenging the myths and stereotypes around sexual harassment, and putting the onus back on the perpetrators of crime. Next slide, please. We also employ the use of a mobile messaging vehicle to deliver key safety messaging. So this vehicle will actually patrol the nighttime economy during late hours on Fridays and Saturday nights, where we put up on the screen all of the messaging we have in regards to keeping safe at night, being safe, planning your journey home, and of course, all of the assets that we rolled out with our Reframe the Night campaign. Next slide, please. So a new Hackney Nights venue accreditation scheme, which we will be launching in January after the festive period, will be completed by licensees online in a new portal and be free to all Hackney operators. Once accredited, venues will receive their toolkits, which includes a certificate and a window sticker, and they'll be listed on the council/Hackney Nights websites. As a council, we really wanted to ask ourselves what a venue should aspire to be and include criteria from other service areas that went beyond just safety. From a women's safety perspective, venues must nominate a women's champion within their organization and sign up to the Mayor of London Safety Charter, for which we have made campaign posters and toolkits available. Staff must also be aware of the Ask Angela campaign and have taken the WAVG training. Excuse me. Hackney accredited venues will also be safe spaces for women who feel like they're being the victim of sexual harassment or assault. Venues must provide a safe space to help vulnerable individuals who need assistance. And these venues will have the badge of their accreditation displayed prominently in the window of their business. And that is to allow members of the public to easily identify accredited venues in Hackney. So really, yeah, last slide, please. Really just a quick tour on some of the things we're doing within nighttime economy. Thank you to everyone for having me here today. If you do need more information, there's a link on the screen, or please feel free to email me for more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samantha Mathis, Late Night Levy Manager. I'll now turn to Maurice Mason, Community Safety Partnerships Manager.
Thank you very much, Cockle, and thank you for organising the event today, which is really important. We heard from Councillor Vajana Thomas around the human aspect of violence against women and girls, and I really do want to underline that because it does affect victims, the families, loved ones, and any of you in the room who have been a victim of that. You know, it really is a very pernicious offence that partnerships have got a responsibility to be able to support. This isn't about women and girls taking responsibility. It's about professionals such as ourselves taking responsibility. So that's why we're committed to the 16 days of action. However, 16 days of action, in my opinion, seems quite truncated. My challenge with the partners from community safety, including everybody who's a professional in this room, is to how can we mainstream the activity. Violence against women and girls is a main priority for community safety, and it has been before some of the high profile and abhorrent cases that sometimes I would suggest are quite unspeakable, some of the things that have actually happened, because they are that traumatic. Following the 16 days of action, and more importantly, or equally as importantly for me, the survey that's going to be promulgated, we are going to have an idea of where in public spaces, where you know, members of the community's concerns are. Because as professionals, you know, we can have a perception, can't we? We can look at the statistics, but of course, everybody knows that statistics don't actually often match reality for a variety of reasons. So once we actually get the survey and the identification of the public space hotspot areas, it's our intention through the leadership of Councillor Vajana Thomas and others to actually then get professional crime reduction people down to the particular area and pose the question, okay, what can we do to make people feel more safe? You know, is it increased street lighting? Is it increased CCTV? Is it pruning the bushes and the hedges, etc., to make people feel safer in the area? At this particular junction, I do want to say that statistically, public space serious sexual assaults in particular is very few in number. However, the impact is through the roof. and particularly if you're a victim of such a horrendous offence. What will then happen is, again, turning that, shall we say, 16 days of action into mainstream activity that's sustainable. Once those proposals have been made, then it will be my duty and responsibility to the community, without talking, too grand about it, to actually then make sure that the feedback is listened to and activity is taken to make the areas feel safer. One of the things that I would say, we have undertaken some analysis of the crime stats, and I have already said that whilst the numbers are few, the impact is through the roof. And certain areas have come out, probably not surprising to you. So the first area where there is, so to speak, a hotspot is the nighttime economy. The second area where there's a hotspot, but again, the numbers are very few, is public green spaces within Hackney, certain public green spaces within Hackney. But there doesn't seem to be any trends or patterns. So just to reassure colleagues, what we will do is we will overlay the information from the analysis with the feedback from the survey, with the work that we're doing with community groups and interested parties. And then our pledge as a panel is that we'll turn that into meaningful activity that hopefully has a corresponding effect in terms of making women and girls and everyone within Hackney feel safer. At this particular junction, I will pause there and hand back to Cockle, but I just wanted to make sure that, because I know members of the community often, having been to a lot of meetings, they can think understandably, okay, that's a 16 days, then you're going to walk away and leave it. What are you actually going to do? And hopefully I've outlined that we're committed to this and we are actually in it for the long run. Back to you, Cockle.
Okay, thanks very much, Maurice. Yeah, I would certainly echo your comments there. We are in it for the long haul, and the work that we're doing through the Commonplace app, as Councillor Fiona Thomas and yourself have mentioned, will feed into the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, alongside other forms of consultation that will be happening over the next few months. So please do keep your eyes peeled for the Council's website for opportunities to participate. So now we'll hand over to DCI Azad Obashian from the Metropolitan Police Services Public Protection Unit for Central East PCU.
Thanks, Carl. Thank you. So my name's Azad Obashian, and I'm one of two DCIs that run the Public Protection Unit at Hackney and also Tower Hamlets as their one borough. I take everything on board that's been said previously, and just to reiterate, the Met has always taken VAWG very seriously. However, there is renewed efforts and renewed attempts at pushing this forward, and the Met has launched a new VAWG action plan, which I'll cover in brevity. But this is supported from the very top, from the Commissioner down, and has very much got the support of local officers that serve Hackney, myself being one of them. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the key objectives, and I won't read this verbatim, is to increase our number of perpetrators brought to justice through good investigation, improve the processes that we are using to care for our victims from the moment they report to the point where they're into the criminal justice system, the court system, and to give them the maximum support that we can do. To reduce repeat victimisation, we've identified through our statistics and analysis of data that there are numerous repeat victims of violence perpetrated against them by perpetrators, and that is a key cohort for us to identify, support, and to put some proactive measures in to prevent further victimisation. Increased confidence of women and the general public around the police's commitment and response to reporting crimes. So we are 100% behind increases in reporting from the members of the public through professionals who have concerns around any VAWG activity to come forward and to liaise with us in a partnership role. We can work together to understand it and come up with a plan to go forward. So we want to see an increase in reporting. Although saying that, we'd like to see a decrease through our activity in partnership with the professionals in the room of women actually being abused. And there'll be a variety of measures for that. Statistics is one of them, but as my colleague rightly says, statistics don't always paint the correct picture. So there's an overlap with the crime survey and also local surveys to get that real picture of what's happening, what's the feeling and what's the perception to obviously drive that down. And there's and internally within the Met, due to unfortunate circumstances that have been covered in the news recently, with the abhorrent actions of certain officers, which I do not support in any way, shape, or form. There is an intensity and activity to bear down on internal misconduct within the police around misogyny, activity that's sexual misconduct. To be frank, there's no place for officers like that within our service, and certainly there's a hostile environment to that sort of activity. And me, as one of the leaders of public protection, I can assure you that when I'm in the office and whatever I see, hear, and do, it won't be tolerated under my watch. And that is a view supported up the organisation to the Commissioner. We've invested in resources to detect internal misconduct and to progress cases where it is alleged. So that's a real commitment from the Met, and for me personally as your local, senior leader. Next slide, please. Okay, so VAWG is a complex area, and it covers numerous different sort of subcategories. So broadly speaking, you've got the public space issue, which has been covered. You've got the issues that occur within the home, the private space, and then there's issues and threats from the online space.
Growing.
And it's growing, as my colleague rightly says, it is growing. We have dedicated teams that target online paedophiles, people that transact imagery of girls being abused. We are dedicated to eradicating that. That's one of the units that I oversee, and I see their hard work every day, and it is increasing. As our ability to detect this gets better, we are encompassing more and more of the online space, and we are present, and we have methodology available to us to pursue and prosecute people that are involved in that sort of crime. So in terms of the outdoor presence, very much linking in with the nighttime economy piece, Shoreditch and nighttime economy has been identified as a place where there is increased vulnerability. So therefore we have increased our presence there with considerable numbers of officers that are deployed there over the weekend, where it's the peak times. I'll come to it a bit later, but there is additional activities taking place, but I will come to that later. And the increased awareness and training around the issues that affect women in that space. Again, a renewed commitment to work with partners to improve the prevention and victim care. So working within the MARAC space, working with social services to get women on board and to have that continued support throughout the process. We can't do it alone. We recognise that. The police are one of many agencies, and we cannot do it alone. And that is recognised, and that permeates throughout our practice. Partnership is key. And bringing offenders to justice and improving our outcomes. COVID has been challenging. It's affected numerous parts of the criminal justice system, including the police. However, we do remain, absolutely determined to tackle this issue, whether it be through sexual violence, domestic abuse, child abuse, and the online space. And I'll come to that in a minute. So next slide, please. So that's the sort of overarching corporate perspective from the Met Police, and that's the vision, and that's what we're working to. But locally, and this is sort of, just me speaking about what we're doing locally and give you a snapshot of our activity. We've got an operation at the moment, Operation Aegis, which is a whole team of officers that have descended upon Hackney Police to improve our practice, to challenge us, dip sample our work, and make sure that we're doing the best possible work. We launched an operation recently, Operation Carolina Blue, which was a week of intense action around domestic abuse, and that considerably increased our detection rate to 30%, 31% actually, and our aspiration in the Met is a 30% detection rate for domestic abuse with the encompassing challenges around that. So that was a focused initiative full of resources focusing on domestic abuse. That has now led to a second operation, which has been replicated across the Met Police, which is a 3-week operation, really intensifying our efforts around detecting perpetrators, prosecuting perpetrators, and supporting victims. And that's ongoing at the moment and dovetails with the 16 days of action. There's weekly performance, bi-weekly performance meetings. There's a real intrusiveness around our response to domestic abuse, with all its challenges, which I do have to recognise that there are challenges in that space. And we obviously are ongoingly developing our staff and supervisors to make sure they're up to date with the best practice. and feeding in from partners' knowledge and awareness. So in terms of sexual offences, there's increased scrutiny on performance and around our response to stuff. We've got an increase in oversight. We've got an increase in a DI, a detective inspector. That brings it to 2 now for the unit. That is, again, to increase that scrutiny and oversight to make sure that nothing gets through the net. There's an additional detective sergeant that is there specifically to review our performance in that area, to make sure that we are hitting everything that we need to do, to make sure that no case goes unprosecuted where the evidence is present. We're engaging with the CPS, been a lot of commentary around our relationship with the CPS. Internally, I can tell you that we are working closely with them to increase our case file building potential, ensuring that we are adhering to the minimum standards and getting early investigative advice for all rapes that involve a suspect identified, to overcome that complexity that so often hinders effective prosecution. It's a very complex area. All allegations of exposure are now dealt with by detectives within the borough. So any person that is suspected or any allegation of exposure will now go to a detective to investigate. We're renewing our recruitment for SOITs to support victims. We've got Operation Roseanne, which is a bespoke operation that supports the nighttime economy. And a bit of detail around that. That is plainclothes officers patrolling that nighttime economy, trying to identify vulnerable females within that space and offering support. That could be through charging a phone to allow them to contact loved ones or services to get them home. That is to intervene to see whether or not potentially they've been spiked, what they're, if they're highly intoxicated, to offer that support and to basically deny the opportunity to perpetrators to get there. So we've got officers out there in plain clothes, and we have been launching that for several weeks with some really good results and good interventions. And when we talk about interventions, we're talking about just minimising the risk to women. So whether that's charging a phone, I count that as someone that's not vulnerable, not going to be preyed upon, and actually we can get them home safely after having a good night. Okay, whilst focusing on the perpetrators, we've stopped men acting suspiciously in that area, and there's been several good results around men that have got antecedents and history for sexual offending, and that's been early intervention, stopping, searching, and denying them that space. Next slide, please. So again, just to canter through it, there are detectives out there. So if any allegations of crime are received in that nighttime economy, we've got detectives from the Sapphire Sexual Offences teams that can immediately deploy, immediately assess the scene, put in place measures to protect evidence, secure evidence, and to make sure the victims get the best possible care while supporting our uniformed colleagues. There's numerous other aspects like the digital, boards out there. There is numerous uniformed officers out there, and there's a deployment of the town centre teams, which are coming online very shortly, which is excellent, and it represents a real commitment to that uplift in officers. We are doing a drug iron atomizer testing, and that's expanded to include GHB and date rape drugs, which are so often seen in spiking cases. So that's ongoing. So there's a real police focus in this whole space. But so going, and just to top off, excuse me, just to give you some examples of our partnership working. Next slide, please. This is a snapshot in time. This doesn't represent, a tenth of what we do. However, here's a very brief example. A social worker receives anonymous information about a woman being abused by her husband. That is fed through to a GP. The GP uses that as a reason to call them in for a routine appointment. That GP gets a disclosure from that female, liaises with the police, we arrest that perpetrator, we then subsequently charge that perpetrator with controlling coercive behaviour, ABH, common assault, spanning a decade. The GP and the social workers provide statements to assist us in our evidence, to overcome some victim lack of engagement after this person's been charged, and that person was found guilty at court and now awaits sentencing. So that's just an example of how we work together. We're referring into MARAC, 153 referrals, 345 Clare's Law applications, and another example from last week, we had a case where social workers received anonymous information that a female was being abused by an older family member. That resulted in intervention and arrest, and that perpetrator was charged with 4 offences of rape against that child. There are many more examples. I work with probation and the MAPA space, again, fully focused on preventing violence against women and girls. And that's it for me, really. And I'm happy to take questions afterwards, but thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Azad. And yes, there will be questions. So I should have said, so questions for the panel, if we can hold off on those until everybody in the panel has spoken, that would probably be helpful, because there may be some issues that more than one panel member wants to contribute to. Okay, so I'm going to ask to join the table two of my colleagues, Francesca and Chris, if that's okay. But our first three, don't go away. Oh no, I just mean don't go too far.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll probably be around for the questions
Yeah.
in a minute. Yep.
It's worth £10,000.
Okay, so thanks all three. And I think, Francesca, we're hearing from yourself next. So, Francesca, so I just let you introduce yourself.
Shall do, Cahill, thank you. My name is Francesca Fada-Archibald. I'm a practice development manager in Young Hackney, which is the early help and prevention service for the council for children from 6 to 19 years old and up to 25 if they have any special educational needs. So I've been with Young Hackney for 10 years, and I don't have any slides, but I'm just going to talk to you about my experience and my knowledge about what our service does to support young people and their families when they experience domestic violence or violence against women and girls. So first of all, I'd like to talk to you about what our approaches are like. So our main partners in this are first and foremost the young people that we work with and their families. So we have a youth work approach. So we centre children and their experiences, and this just applies also when children experience any form of harmful sexual behaviour or when they perpetrate any form of harmful sexual behaviour, and also when they experience domestic violence. And over the years, we've had a lot of referrals for individuals who have either perpetrated or been victims of domestic violence or sexual abuse, and they might have witnessed such things occurring. So what we do is we work with young people on an individual basis, and whenever we get a referral, if it's from somebody who has perpetrated, we think about their victims and liaise with other partners to find out if they're getting support as well. So we think very, very widely about this issue, and we work with everybody that is involved with that child or family from the beginning to understand how they're supporting them in dealing with these issues. Another key aspect of our approach is that we work systemically. So we really put a lot of emphasis on relationships and understanding the social context in which young people operate. So we try to understand, where children have had the experience of violence, or if there are any other contextual factors that compound that experience. So, for example, we try to understand their home life, if anything might have happened to them in the past linked to their home life. But we also try to understand their peer groups, and if there are any issues that we can support young people, because sometimes there are links to peer groups as well. And we work in partnership with schools as well, because sometimes children experience have these experiences with a sexual harassment in school, or perpetrated in schools. So what we try to do is to understand both we try to be trauma informed, which means we try to understand the story behind people that perpetrate harmful sexual behavior, because they might have traumatized themselves. We sometimes see that young people who perpetrate some level of sexually harmful behavior, and it's a big spectrum, sometimes they've witnessed domestic violence themselves, or they've been victim of another form of violence. So, you know, there's a circle there and a contextual thing that we try to hold in mind very much. And also we try to sort of understand, you know, how does this impact, and try to work with perpetrators to understand the impact they've had on their victims, but also to obviously be trauma informed in terms of the victims, because sometimes we find that young girls that or women within families that are impacted by these, the trauma is such that it's very difficult, and we have to be very sensitive in how we approach it and talk about it, and we have to be guided by what they want us to do and how they want us to do it. And also we try to be very intersectional about it, so we take into account if the people that we're working with have other additional needs, or if they've experienced other things, or if, you know, because of their, you know, cultural background or gender or other, you know, disabilities, if this compounds their experience of either perpetrating or being impacted by violence. We try as much as we can to be restorative. It is not always possible to approach scenarios of domestic violence according to a restorative lens, but at least we do consider if there is a possibility of any kind of restorative intervention to repair harm. But at the very least, if that is not possible, we do try to raise awareness, you know, especially with the perpetrator, of the impact that their actions have had on their direct victim, but also potentially on others around them. And so that's how we approach the work with individuals. But there's a lot of great work that we also do, and we have done for the last 10 years with, you know, schools especially. So we do a lot of group work in school that centres encouraging young people to have positive relationships, but also encouraging young people to have conversations about their experiences of sexual violence, sexual harassment. And again, we do this very sensitively and in partnership with their schools. More often than not, schools could refer individuals, and when they do, we always consider and speak to them about, okay, you've referred this individual specifically, is there something that we could potentially do with a whole class group or with a wider group of children? And sometimes we consider this even if referrals come from a situation that has taken place in the community, like, for example, you know, a park or in the street. So we're always having all of those things and holding all of those things in mind. So as we speak, there are many group works going on, especially in secondary schools, where our teams are addressing sexual violence and harmful sexual behaviour and harassment against women and girls. And we have a wonderful team called the Health and Wellbeing team. They offer workshops and group work around a wide range of subjects, including this one, and they're very active, not only in our secondary and special schools, but also in some primary schools, because we do get contacted sometimes by primary schools where, you know, certain behaviours occur and they want to work in partnership with us to see what's possible to get done. And whenever that happens, myself and colleagues will talk to them, and we'll also bring in other agencies, possibly, like, for example, our Safer School officers, which can also contribute to having those conversations with children. And we try to, whatever that we do, we also try to make it age appropriate, because this is a subject that affects children in different ways, different stages, different ages. So the way in which we have these conversations with children is very important to us. So as well as all this group work that happens in schools, we talk to young people and take action in our hubs. So now in particular that there is the 16 days of action, there's lots of activity going on in our hubs. So we have regular group work of young women and young men in our hubs where we talk about this subject, and where young people come to us with their experiences and they share what is happening for them. And so we have those opportunities basically every day of the week that the young people come to us in the hubs. But in particular for this week, we're really trying to engage more young people and have a spotlight. And so we are, creating pledge walls in the hubs, encouraging staff and young people to say what they would like to do for the rest of the year and beyond when it comes to addressing violence against women and girls. We have all the posters that you will all have seen down there. They will be up there. The young people will be engaged in a social media campaign. They will be posting their own messages of support. Also, we will be reaching out and taking young people to see a play. It's a production called Maryland at Stratford East that speaks to violence against women and girls, and it's based on recent stories that have been in the media that police colleagues were alluding to. Also because we are creative and we want to give young people outlets to express themselves. We are running a competition. There's going to be like a musical theme. We have, people that come into the hubs that do music production with young people, and we would like young people to produce like a musical piece that speaks to either their experience or their feelings around this subject. So this will also culminate in, an end celebration after the 2 weeks, and possibly not at the end of these 2 weeks, but longer term, the young people would like to work on a video based around street harassment, because we're currently also collaborating with the British Transport Police on what they're doing both in school and in the community around what happens when young women and young girls are on public transport. So there's going to be lots of things that will go way beyond. We will be showing young people content. We are acquiring a library or DVDs and other books and things that young people will have access to throughout the year, which talks around this subject. And last but not least, we've mentioned a lot about, and the campaign is about violence against women and girls, but we do emphasize the importance of working with young boys and young men. So we are thinking about how we can train our staff. So we are working in partnership, designing with the health and wellbeing team, our clinical hub in children and family services, and our staff. And some of the young people we work with, we are designing a harmful sexual behavior kind of toolkit and training that develops how we can approach this. And so this is essentially a flavor of what we do, how we do it, how we've been doing it for the last 10 years, and what we'll be doing in the next 16 days for the campaign. And I pass over to Chris, who can talk further about what is done by Hackney Education in our schools. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Francesca. So my name is Chris Roberts. I'm a Head of Wellbeing and Education Safeguarding at Hackney Education. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that goes on at Hackney Education, done some that's going on specifically in schools. If you can do next slide, please, Tara. This last year, in terms of violence against women and girls, has been come to significantly high profile one, particularly for schools. It's been the catalyst for action that happens in lost schools. Outside of that, there's been the murders of Sabrina Nessa, Sarah Everard, Beba Henry, Nicole Smallman, and others that have brought this to high profile attention and brought that action. But particularly for schools was the Everyone's Invited website. And for those people who may not be familiar with it, this came to very much prominence earlier in the year. it had obviously an agenda around exposing and eradicating rape culture, but what you saw on that was tens of thousands. I looked on the other day, there was over 50,000 testimonies on there from young women who reported about their own experiences of harassment, abuse, assault from boys in their own schools, in their neighbourhoods, or at their universities. Most of those reports were anonymous, but often the schools those children attended, those young people attended, were named. And what you saw on that was schools up and down this country, a pervasive culture that existed out there. There was independent schools, state schools, universities, special schools. It was endemic out there, what was being reported. And not only the incidents were happening in schools, they were happening outside. Sometimes these issues were being reported at parties. And so amongst their peer groups, so it was not all school-based, it was sometimes out of school, but it was between those peers. And that acted, I think, for a real big catalyst for national action on that. And it's not to say schools weren't doing stuff in this space beforehand, but I think it was a wake-up call that came from that. One of the actions from it was the Department for Education asked Ofsted to carry out a sort of a more detailed assessment of what was going on, what was understanding out there. If you can do the next slide for me, please, Tara. And I was going to briefly over what the Ofsted investigation found. And this was a national investigation, visiting schools up and down the country, different types of schools in different contexts. And what they found is where schools were dealing, aware of incidents, they were dealing with it. But what they were aware of was woefully unaware of what was kind of going on beneath the surface, both online and in their schools. And the girls were talking there about being sent unsolicited explicit sexual messages, pressure to send new videos, much more prevalent than adults actually realised this was going on. And what they also found is, talking to the girls, that this level of sexual harassment had become so commonplace, it had become like normalised, and it had become to the point where actually it wasn't reported. So the teachers and leaders in schools were not aware about it. It was going on under the surface. Girls didn't believe anything would actually happen if they responded to it. When they talked about, the support that was in the schools around their sex and relationships education, they were rarely complimentary around it. So it was taught by teachers who didn't really want to address the issues, and what you often find in, some schools is sex and relationships education is taught by the history teacher, the RE teacher, the geography teacher on top of that, who are not specialists in that. And I think that's one of the things that's great with Young Hackney here, is we have people who are specialists who can help and support around that. But the biggest challenge was teachers and leaders just really underestimated the scale of the problem. And and where it was happening, behaviours were not being challenged. So sometimes behaviours amongst teachers were being normalised as well. And what they were hearing is that bystander issue. When it was seen in the classrooms, sometimes it would be normalised and just, oh, that's just banter. How do you tackle banter? And what this investigation has been that catalyst for that real change. And it's been that change that occurs in schools. So following the Ofsted investigation, do you want to change slides, Tara? What their big recommendation was, and there was loads of little recommendations, but ultimately is that schools should create a culture where sexual harassment and online sexual abuse are just not tolerated. And where those issues are identified, they intervene early. And the other critical thing was, because where some of those schools were completely blind to what was going on in their school, or underestimating the level and extent of it, is even if you were not getting any incidents reported to you, assume it is happening in your school. And I think that is a critical shift. Rather than responding to the data, as I think Maurice mentioned earlier, the data doesn't tell the whole story. There is underpinning that. There is a whole load of reporting. If it's not being reported, that doesn't mean to say you've got a problem. And so assume that has happening, assume sexual harassment is taking place, assume there is online sexual abuse is happening in your setting, and put in place a whole school strategy to address this. And that was one of the key drivers out of that. And that's been the catalyst for change in schools generally. And what we've seen over the summer, working with schools, and when the report was published back in the summer, we got together school leaders and actually said, look, this is a report we're going to need to action on this. So Hackney Education brought together heads, particularly in our secondary schools, and to governors, and talk them through what the report was and what the conclusions of that report found. And what we've seen from there is schools really stepping up to the mark, recognising the challenges of this, and Francesca talks about some of the work that was going on in schools. But they are critically about how do you understand the issue, understanding what is happening in your context, understanding what is happening in your setting. How is it going? So they're promoting things like harmful sexual behaviour self-assessments, so you can benchmark yourself as a setting in school. But actually, more importantly, talking to the pupils in your school. And schools have done focus groups with their girls and their boys. And I think engaging with boys in this is very critical as well, because this is, you know, if you develop, it's not all boys, and boys are very much part of that culture. And you need to develop those boys to be both challenged and be empowered to challenge behaviour and banter that they see as well. In that, reviewing the incidents that they have occurred, what is happening there, but also creating that safer space where reporting can take place. So schools have been looking at their reporting systems and how they can create anonymous reporting, how they can create a space where actually if you bring forward these issues, they will be believed, they will be responded to, and they will be dealt with in a way that it feels the young people are empowered in those decision making. Because one of the concerns that came through in the Ofsted report was often why young people didn't want to report as well, is they worried about losing control of that. And also whether it would end up in a formalised process. And sometimes they often didn't want the young person who was the perpetrator criminalised, social services, they just wanted it to stop and the young person to learn. You know, and that was often came through in the report as well. There's looking about training staff, and they've done a big piece of work schools have done about training staff and making sure they're aware of the issues, working, sending out information to their parents around there, and working with children across the board, so who are holding assemblies to generally raise awareness. The critical thing though is working on that long-term goal that critically comes from that. So it comes through the, I think the professionalisation and the upgrading of the sex and relationships education that goes on in schools, because that will have the long-term lasting impact. Whether you're looking around issues around tackling about healthy relationships, keep revisiting issues around consent, keep looking at how, what is acceptable behaviour, both online, and breaking down some of those norms that have been established out there amongst young people through, particularly through online culture, online porn, online chatting, and breaking those down and challenging and saying that is not okay, that is not normal, that is not healthy, and breaking that down, and that will have the long-term impact. So the work that Young Hackney are doing will help schools do that on that space and that journey. But their schools are doing that, and I think this will see a, galvanised change around, particularly around PSHE and sex and relationships education, which has now been put on the statutory footing in schools as well. So that would be that long-term impact and that long-term change. But the critical thing, and I think, is schools are not in isolation. Schools do need to work in partnership. And I think what has been heartening is schools have not just been doing this on their own. They've been working with the Safer Schools police officers. They've been working with Young Hackney and the local authority, because actually this is bigger than just schools to tackle, or working out, and it does require that partnership approach. Tara, if you want to just go through actually 2 slides, which I think have gone past mine. There you go, the next one after that. It's going to be bigger than what you can achieve there. Because this issue and tackling this issue is going to be bigger than what schools can achieve. But what schools are good at is educating young people. And as Amanda Spillman there, the Chief Inspector at Ofsted, said, schools can't solve all the society's problems. But good schools doing what they do really well can make a difference. And schools are good at educating young people. And that is what they are good at. And if they can turn their sort of shoulder to this, put their to it and muscle to it, you make a good effort about educating the next generation of young adults around what is okay, what is not okay. And I think everyone's invited. The murders that I mentioned earlier have highlighted issues, empowered girls to actually raise issues and actually talk about this, and force boys to have to confront some of their own behaviours. And I think what we are is that tipping point of change, I think, and I feel optimistic about the future on this. But it's not going to be solved overnight. It's not going to be one of those quick wins. And it can't be just 16 days, because that's not going to solve it in 16 days. But it is those inflection points that enable you to bring about change that's going to deliver long-term change for young people and society is going forward.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you. And thank you, Francesca, as well again. So I'm going to speak for a short amount of time, hopefully, before we turn to questions for the whole panel. I'm going to speak on partnership approaches to domestic abuse. Can people at the back hear me okay? And if not, I should say there are a few seats up at the front as well. People are struggling. Okay, so I thought it would be useful, just at the next slide, just to refresh our memories about what domestic abuse is. And it has been redefined by statute this year by the Domestic Abuse Act 2021. I won't read the whole screen, but just to put in people's minds that there are 3 elements needed for something to be termed domestic abuse: that the people involved are 16 or over, that they're personally connected to one another, and that the behaviour involved is abusive. It feels self-evident, but I think it's always worth, when we encounter people either in our personal lives or through our work, and they're describing a situation or we're observing a situation, to think up to ourselves, is this actually domestic abuse, what I'm saying or what I'm hearing? As we know, domestic abuse can take many forms, from physical and sexual abuse, violent and threatening behaviour, controlling or coercive behaviour, economic abuse, psychological or emotional abuse, or other forms. The thing I would like to highlight is that the government have now rightly highlighted controlling and coercive behaviour in statute. So it's really important, again, that we as agencies become mindful of and attuned to detecting, controlling and coercive behaviour when it occurs. The other thing that the law now makes clear is that when thinking about domestic abuse, we shouldn't think merely about a whole pattern of behaviours, but also just one incident. So if one thing happens that meets those criteria, then it is domestic abuse, and we should treat it as seriously as if it's a long-standing pattern of behaviour. So when we come to the next slide around partnership working, so obviously the theme of today's event and what my colleagues have spoken on is partnership working in various settings. It's important, I think, to always ask ourselves why partnership working is important in the field of domestic abuse. Again, the recent guidance attached to the Domestic Abuse Act makes it very, very clear. It says, given the complex nature of domestic abuse, a multi-agency response is critical to identify victims and their families at an early stage and before reaching crisis point. So again, the law requires us to work together to address domestic abuse. It's also important to bear in mind that a child, any child, who sees or hears or experiences the effects of domestic abuse is a victim of that abuse. So it's important that when we work with families, that we see that any child in the home is A, likely to be affected, and then B, is likely to need a response to any domestic abuse that's happening. Another thing that's worth bearing in mind, when we think about the MARAC meetings that local authorities have, in which my colleague Azad mentioned earlier, MARAC stands for the Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference. It's a multi-agency forum that we have in Hackney. It happens every fortnight. It's well resourced and well staffed by the partnership. It deals with high-risk domestic abuse cases. And again, the sort of gold standard, the Safe Lives guidance says that multi-agency action plans should address the risks to the victim, safeguard children and adults who are at risk, and manage perpetrator behaviour. And to do all of those things, you need all of the agencies involved in order to effect change. So the next slide. And I think it's also important to bear in mind that the end point of domestic abuse is all too often the death of an innocent person. It's a family who are grieving, children who are left without a parent, a society that's damaged as a consequence of murder or manslaughter. When I took over the Council's Domestic Abuse Service in 2015, one of the first things that I did was met with the family of a young woman who had been murdered in Hackney several years previously. The lessons that they shared, the pain that they obviously still felt and still feel, highlighted to me the ways in which system failure has a real effect on people's lives. And the preventable deaths that occur as domestic abuse are all too often characterised by a failure of partnership working, of very simple processes. So when I designed the Domestic Abuse Intervention Service, which launched in 2016, these are the sorts of principles that underpinned its design, the idea of homicide prevention. So the first thing that's important is that we map, any of us working with families around domestic abuse, that we map the partnership systems around both the victims and the perpetrators. Traditionally, all too often, time and effort and pressure is placed on the victim of the abuse without properly being aware of who's working with this perpetrator. What levers do we, as a professional system, have that we can pull to affect change in this perpetrator's behaviour? We should always be considering things like, who are the housing officers? Does the perpetrator have a social worker? Do they have a mental health worker? Who are the GPs for both perpetrator and victim? Is there a substance misuse worker undertaking work with the perpetrator or victim? What criminal justice pathways can be in place or need to be in place? By mapping the whole system, we can start to understand holistically what the risks and needs are, and then start to develop a multi-agency plan to effect change. Part of that involves engagement with the partnership to share information and reduce risk. Practitioners are often timid in the domestic abuse field around sharing information. The law is very clear that confidentiality is important. People should consent for their information to be shared, but there are circumstances in which information needs to be shared without consent in order to reduce serious harm. Practitioners need to be confident about sharing information. They also need to be aware of risks, as risk is a dynamic factor. We can't and shouldn't have one type of service for clients who have been labelled as medium risk, and a completely different type of service provision for victims who have fallen into a category of high risk. It's important that the principles that underpin good domestic abuse work are applied to all victims and perpetrators at all designated levels of risk. Risk will not, in all probability, stay the same. So better to act sooner before harm gets more serious, rather than wait until we have the formal MARAC meeting structure and then start to talk to our partner agencies about things that a perpetrator is doing. That importance of early intervention joint safety planning happens, as I say, at all stages, and it needs to be applied to perpetrators as well as the victims. So we should be working with the partnership, building on what Azad said earlier, to use the whole array of levers, of capabilities that we as a professional system have against perpetrators. We need to use our powers that we have to deter them from perpetrating abuse in the first place. When it happens, to apprehend and sanction perpetrators of harm, but also to engage with them. So the criminal justice process must always come first. Domestic abuse is a crime and needs to be treated as such. Often, the criminal justice pathway can't take us to where we need to get to, despite the best efforts of police or prosecutors. So it's important that we engage perpetrators and work where we can to reduce the risk that they pose. And that's something that the Domestic Abuse Intervention Service does, both individually, but also through a group program for perpetrators. It's really important, and something that Children and Families Service in Hackney have been doing well, I think, for the last couple of years, is focusing on the source of the harm, not on the victim of the harm. So in Children and Families, we have, since 2019, had the Safe and Together approach to domestic abuse, where we focus our efforts on keeping the child safe and together with a non-abusive parent, engaging with the perpetrator of harm, describing their behaviour, challenging them about their behaviour, and making a plan with the perpetrator of harm to change, instead of placing all the pressure on the victim. And it's important that we do that even in settings where there are no children, where we engage the perpetrator as a professional system and say, this is what you're doing, these are the consequences of it. You need to work with us to change your behaviour, or these will be the further consequences. Perpetrators themselves often come with a cluster of complex and enduring needs and vulnerabilities themselves. It's important that the professional system, again, not just uses levers in a punitive way, but uses levers in a supportive way to, if we think that the perpetrator's untreated substance misuse is a contributory factor to their lifestyle, and that their lifestyle is a contributory factor to their behaviour, then it makes sense to address that substance misuse so that we can take the pressure away from the victim and the family. It's important as well as a professional system that when errors occur, and they do, and they always will, unfortunately, that we treat those errors as opportunities. When an error happens in a case, we should assume, until proven otherwise, that that error is an example of a system weakness. Something has not happened in this instance. Hopefully, that error hasn't resulted in death or serious injury, but let's assume until we find out otherwise that this is an indicator that the professional system isn't working properly, and then we need and find out what we need to fix. We use case examples as a partnership to explore blockages in the system, misunderstandings that can happen, role issues. How often have we had a conversation with someone where we say, oh, I thought you were going to do that, and they say, oh, I thought you were going to do that. In most instances, that's absolutely fine and no harm results. But in something as serious as domestic abuse, role confusion or misunderstandings can result in very serious harm indeed. So it's important that we use any example to explore what has gone on, that we take an approach a collaborative approach with our partnership and recruit partner agencies to see the problems that have occurred, either on a micro level or at a bigger system level, as co-owned, and that they need to also be co-resolved. We can and do undertake joint quality assurance work. For example, the MARAC forum that I mentioned previously. We have twice-yearly multi-agency audits of high-risk domestic abuse cases, so that we can, in a supportive and challenging way, as a partnership, look at what every agency did on a case, see if there are opportunities for learning, and most of all, opportunities for improvement, so that any near misses, any errors that occurred, that we minimise the probability of those happening in future, and overall develop improved systems. The other principle that's really important is that we hear survivors' voices. So we can't assume that the changes that we institute are necessarily the changes that are going to result in the most good for the most people most of the time. So in our service, we regularly take feedback from clients. We've also undertaken consultation through the Council's dedicated change support team with users of our service. And as I mentioned earlier, with the upcoming Violence Against Women and Girls strategy being refreshed, we'll be taking submissions from particular groups of survivors of domestic abuse, women across different groups, and also users of our services. So all in all, I hope that we will get a rich tapestry of input from across the piece. So next slide, please. Sorry, Tara. So in thinking about how we work as a partnership, I think it's useful to think from the micro out to the macro. So as this diagram shows, I hope, we should always start with practice. So where do we see partnership working in practice in Hackney? We see it through our casework, with victims and with perpetrators. We see it through our anti-racist practice that we institute in Children and Family Service and across the council. We have the MARAC meeting that I mentioned earlier, which is a forum that, as I say, meets fortnightly. We discuss a high number of high-risk domestic abuse cases. We work as a partnership to improve outcomes and sanction perpetrators. We have the Safe and Together approach, which I mentioned as well, which is, again, involves partner agencies taking a joined-up approach to perpetrators of abuse. When, unfortunately, domestic homicides do take place, we're mandated to undertake reviews of those. They, again, pull together the partnership to identify opportunities for learning and help us as a local authority and Hackney Partnership develop plans for improvement. We also do public consultation, as I mentioned, and also we deliver training in our service. So we go out to other agencies, we hopefully help them learn more and feel more confident about domestic abuse, but in so doing, we also hear from them about what's working well and not well in the system. And that gives us a feedback loop through which we can affect change. So that, and all of that practice work that we as a service do feeds up at the next level of management. We have a range of groups. I won't read through every one. We have a range of steering groups that focus on specific issues. We're undertaking accreditation with the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance in cooperation with our housing services in Hackney and our housing needs service in Hackney. We have the White Ribbon accreditation, obviously at a more strategic level, but also at a management level, which also mandates us as a local authority to take certain types of approaches when it comes to a zero tolerance of violence against women and girls. We have, at a strategic level, the Violence Against Women and Girls Strategy and Action Plan, which is overseen again by the partnership. And we also deal with MOPAC and London councils, because Hackney and what we do is obviously part of a wider London fabric. We feed up into that fabric and we learn from it. So starting with practice, I guess the thing I would want to emphasise is that the lessons we learn in practice are fed upwards and outwards throughout the whole partnership. And I hope influence that partnership and the strategic way of being. So I'd like to give just, if I can, 2 examples of where I think that has worked well. So in terms of, next slide, yeah. So this is one example of where partnership working, I think, at a practice level has fed upwards to a strategic level. In terms of trauma-informed approaches to therapeutic support. So what we were finding during the period of COVID restrictions, through our casework and through the casework of colleagues, is that victims of domestic abuse had inconsistent access to therapeutic support. And there were particular concerns around groups that were already marginalised or excluded, and their access in particular to therapeutic support. The training that we were providing as a service to partner agencies during the COVID restriction period also highlighted that many residents across Hackney felt vulnerable, and again, that the COVID restrictions had compounded existing vulnerabilities and isolations that people felt. We commissioned research, as mentioned, from the Change Support team. Survivors of domestic abuse who had used our service highlighted the need for ongoing support after the crisis had passed and after they had been made safer. We were also at a managerial level throughout the COVID restrictions period. As a service, we were chairing fortnightly partnership meetings with agencies in the third sector, statutory sector, health, police, and so on. These meetings were designed to identify any vulnerabilities in the whole system around domestic abuse. And one of the things, again, that it identified was the issue around lack of consistent support for therapeutic recovery services for victims and their children. So on the strength of those different feedback loops, we've initiated a review with the partnership of what therapeutic support there is in Hackney and how it can be improved. We're working on an ongoing basis with our partners in the Clinical Commissioning Group, East London Foundation Trust, the Homerton Hospital Trust, our own clinical service and Children and Family Service, and Public Health, as well as the Psychological Therapies and Wellbeing Alliance. So that work, it hasn't finished yet. It probably will take some time to complete, but the work is looking at what pathways are there for victims who need trauma-informed therapeutic intervention, and their children also. How as a whole system how easy are we as a whole system to access for those who need it? What more resource, if any, needs to go into the system to make it accessible? And how will we monitor and continue to improve the delivery that we have? Because what we know as a system is, the more we can address trauma, particularly in children caused by domestic abuse, the more we can address that earlier in childhood, the less likely it is that those children are going to grow up themselves as teenagers and young adults in their relationships to have problematic behaviours or to be further victimised. So thinking as from a long view, it makes sense for us as a council and as a partnership to take this incredibly seriously. And the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, which I mentioned, which is in development, this will be a key plank of that. Okay, so I've got one more example of how practice has fed upwards into at a partnership level into strategic change. So in terms of domestic abuse, adult safeguarding and older people, it's common, as I mentioned, in our casework to work jointly with partner agencies. In fact, it's required, I think, to arrive at good outcomes. During the COVID period, we became more and more aware of the difficulty in intervening successfully around the field of intergenerational domestic abuse. And when I say that, I mean people who are being harmed not by their partner or their ex-partner, but by a family member, often somebody they live with, but sometimes they live outside of the home. It seemed as well experientially that intergenerational domestic abuse was not only rising during the COVID restriction period, but also that it was becoming even more intractable because we had, for example, adult sons who had previously been sofa surfing with friends now returning to their parents' address where they felt that they couldn't leave, and the parents felt that they couldn't make them leave, and then the abusive behaviours were happening in the home, and on top of that, the parents had other constant public messaging telling them don't leave the home because it's not safe to do so. So all of those things together, it seemed, made it look as though there was a rise in intergenerational domestic abuse. So although we were, I think, as a service and a council and as a partnership, really good at getting messages out that if there is domestic abuse, people should and can leave the home to be safe, and we continue to push that message. For people's lived experiences, they often felt vulnerable, restricted, and isolated, and trapped with their family member who was hurting them. Also, we have a MARAC steering group that oversees the functioning and performance of the fortnightly MARAC. We decided to introduce a new data set that we're not required to measure, but that of intergenerational domestic abuse. Months later, it's transpired that in this financial year alone, 20% of the high-risk domestic abuse discussed at MARAC is intergenerational in nature, rather than from a partner or previous partner. And again, as mentioned earlier, the approach that we take in Hackney, which the steering group takes, which our domestic homicide review implementation group takes, and which we as a service take, is that we're going to best prevent homicides through being assertive and through having helpful partnership working. So we instituted in the Domestic Abuse Intervention Service, we instituted a working group with our colleagues in Adult Safeguarding, Children and Family Service, East London Foundation Trust, Clinical Commissioning Group, Homerton, Turning Point, our housing ASB colleagues, and the police, and the Adult Safeguarding Board to look at vulnerable adults, domestic abuse, and intrafamilial abuse, all as part of the same picture. We also were lucky in that our local partners, NIA, who offer IDVA support for women who experience domestic abuse, have received funding for a specialist worker for women over 55. So that development, plus the working group that we instituted, has led to the development of two things which I think will have concrete value for residents in Hackney. The first is that we've created a specific pathway for domestic abuse and adult safeguarding. That pathway, if executed correctly by all agencies involved, will lead to very simple but effective changes of practice across the partnership. And whenever someone who is a vulnerable adult is either experiencing harm or causing harm to others. We've also created the Hackney Intergenerational Domestic Abuse Protocol. That's been launched at a specific event on the 8th of December online. So anybody who's interested can please attend that. And that again sets out key responsibilities, duties, and benefits of good partnership working when it comes to intergenerational domestic abuse. As far as I'm aware, it's the first of its kind in the country. It's been signed off by our Adults Board and our Children's Partnership. It will form a plank of ongoing partnership training so that the whole partnership feels confident in its use and understands its reasoning. And also, as I said, it will hopefully promote Hackney's work at a national level, and other local authorities who are already interested in the work we're doing in this field will hopefully learn from us, so that residents who live outside of Hackney can also benefit from it. I think that was my last slide. And so this is an opportunity for questions or feedback, not only for me, but for anybody who has spoken today. So I know Samantha and Morris and Azad are still here. I don't know if Tara, if the sound will pick up people if they speak over there. Okay, so if people have a question, if they want to, so people maybe, if you want to sit. Yeah. Okay, does anybody have any questions? Maybe we should check if anybody has any questions first, sorry. Oh yes, hi, yes.
I'll be honest.
Oh, sorry, yeah, sorry, Councillor Etty, yeah.
Okay, thank you for the presentation, and I sincerely commend the partnership work that we have had about. And in regards to housing needs as well, housing benefits and needs, I can confirm that there's a good partnership in terms of working, also we're working with at London. One of my questions is to you. You talked about the engagement and the feedback. And I want to know the time frame of the feedback when anything is being reported. In your first slide, you talked about feedback.
Is that the start?
No, not the app. I mean, in your first, I think it's the first it's on your first slide. When people come to report, and then you say you feedback to the residents or whoever that comes to report as part of the way you are assisted. And I'm just curious when it comes to that feedback, because I want to think if we see a lot of feedback within the community, it will filter right, and then everyone will have to say this is how much reported, and this is how much feedback I've gotten. This is how, and apart from doesn't really calculate or something like that. So I just want a bit of more detail when it comes to that, in terms of that. Maybe if you just check this slide.
Sorry, do you mind just
Okay, do you want to come here? You want to join us there? We can do.
I'd like to ask you a question. What's the slide?
And I feel so because I'm so apologize because I need to be in campaign for 2 o'clock and to the schools as well. I mean, just thinking, I know a lot of but I'm thinking there's still a gap because we could still have some children or who are still being fearful of reporting. And I'm just thinking if we could have something like we call red box. The poster box, the red box poster box. If it's something that we can, one way or the other, find a way of introducing so that anyone that has that fear of coming to the teachers to report can just write something in there and just put it in the post box. And then teachers can go through probably from time to time. I don't know if we have any system of such in place, but this is just one of the things that just occurred to me because I can see there's a lot of good work, but there's still some gap. And lastly, this morning they talked about if we have champion, if we have violence against women and girls champion in schools. So if we have champions within the students, it makes it much more open for them to have that conversation amongst themselves, among their peers, and also when they get to their parents. So maybe it's something we could also look into when we come to the champion, with regards to the students and also from the teachers as well. And I want to commend everyone for the great work. That's all that. Thank you.
Thanks. So I've got the slides up. Would you mind just pointing to the question?
No, this one. There's another one. No, not Hackney. It says, hold on. It's feedback. Let's go. Sorry. This one? Hold on. Next. Yeah, that's it. Engaging with women and girls and responding to their feedback.
Right. So we've got numerous. So we've got our SOITs that liaise with the victims of serious sexual abuse. So whatever feedback we get is fed back to a central unit that can help build our policy and shape our policy better. In terms of the local, we've got the Safe Neighbourhoods partnerships with our uniformed colleagues. So whenever we get information around hotspots or areas of emerging concern, whether it be through exposure, sexual assaults or abuse, we feed it into them to incorporate into their policing plan, into that area. So the nighttime economy plan, the winter nights plan, there's numerous plans around foot patrol, and that's fed back into them.
Thank you. So I'm mindful of time, and I know the mayor's here just before 2, but Chris, was there anything you wanted to add around schools there?
Yeah, I was just going to add that. I mean, a lot of schools do have reporting mechanisms in place. Some of them have those kind of boxes out, things like head of year offices. Some have anonymous online reporting tools. And I certainly know schools have been reviewing that in the wake of this to try and, and the critical thing is it is about building confidence amongst the young people to report. And that is not going to be just adult-led. It needs to be young person-led as well. And I know some of the work Young Hackney have been doing in schools, and I've certainly heard stories from some schools where actually schools leaders are engaging with the young people in their schools to understand the context for them and understand what the issues and helping them shape what this looks like, because if that's where you'll get the confidence, and if you're working with the young people rather than doing to the young people, and lots of the schools are doing that kind of work, that's when you're going to galvanise the change and give confidence to young people around reporting and knowing what will happen when they report.
And I would just add that part of the white ribbon accreditation that Hackney has obtained means that we'll be delivering a white ribbon action plan, and part of that has championship roles as a key delivery of the white ribbon change campaign. So we'll be coming to Young Hackney in schools around how we recruit to the champions in that work, in that setting as well. Were there any other questions?
Councillor Williams at the back.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
No, I was,
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I didn't see you there. The screen was covering your.
just a couple of questions. Thank you everyone for your presentations as well. But just, Young Hackney, love what you all do, follow you on everything, the initiatives that you all do is really the way forward, just to say that. In terms of like, especially the school and everything else, isn't most of it to do with funding as to how all these initiatives can be put forward to make things better for everyone? Because nobody talked about funding. And I must say, the partnership presentation you gave, that was, my personal opinion, that was very long. That some of it was just like, in that writing and everything. I did hear what you say, I'm not dissing you or nothing, but I'm just saying it was a lot. And you're speaking to people who are actually kind of like in the profession, so it was kind of just repetitive and that. But in terms of the whole thing, funding is the major issue for everything that needs to be done to make things better for anyone. Has anybody got anything that they can say about that?
So what we do in school is free. So the funding that we get is the funding that comes through the council, or some of the activities that we do with these commission providers that work out in the community with the young people. So sometimes schools buy into certain approaches that they deliver in their own schools, but in Hackney we're very lucky to have Young Hackney, the health and wellbeing team in particular, and also other organisations that we work in partnership with, and it will not cost the school anything, but in some cases it can be an issue in some schools, maybe elsewhere, where the funding they might require funding to do more activity, I suppose.
I think also within schools particularly, obviously the Young Hackney offer, as Francesca just mentioned, is obviously fully funded. Schools have to do a lot of some of this work anyway, and some of it is about pivoting it towards the issue. So it is around, like, they have to have systems for safeguarding. It's about making sure you're working with young people to make sure these issues come to the fore. They have to deliver relationships and sex education. That's now statutory, but you're putting it through the prism of, having greater awareness, greater insights of some of the challenges that come from that. So some of this is building on schools but it's about how do you change in the culture, and it's not, resources is part of that, but a lot of it's about actually a culture and challenging and tackling the issue and working with the young people and the adults in the school setting to try and tackle that and raise awareness and educate young people, which is what schools do.
Just to quickly add, in terms of today, we've invited partners from the community and voluntary sector to come in the room that knows what we are doing. But having said that, we got people logging in, and the point of today is for us to be able to explain to people what is happening, the various work strands that is happening in the borough, the way we are responding and tackling violence against women and girls. So today is not primarily for people that knows what we are doing. So if you find it is too long for you, I'm just sorry, I've forgotten the name. If you find it, Ross, if you find it too long, it's for the benefit of people that are listening, logging in to know what we are doing in responding to violence against women and girls in Hackney. Thanks very much. I think we still have Councillor Williams, probably the last.
Yes, so I just want to speak on something that was being discussed this morning in a meeting with the of London on violence against women and girls. And we were talking about not just schools, but also colleges and universities and the relationships that we have with them, and the offer, I guess, of partnership with them. How we can not only work with them to raise awareness, but help train them and offer opportunities. I don't know what we are doing with universities, but as a lead member for Development Skills, what I have been doing is working out with officers how we can develop that partnership across higher education. So we really need to have some follow-up conversations, as the jobs understands, and officers specifically around violence against women and partner with universities, as more and more come to come stream with our partnership working. I'm not sure if you're aware, Phil, but we have put in a bid to develop a network with the universities. So I'm hoping that in the coming months and years, that we'll have to. But I think this is a really important area. We can't only start with schools. To raise awareness to tackle violence against women and girls, we have got to work with everyone at both ends of the age scales. So higher education and universities is really vital in that light.
Thanks very much. We're going to take this offline. Conscious of.
So I think the stream ends at 2, it's all very close to. So we'll take the other questions. And I think the last contribution is really important, Councillor Williams. Obviously, I wasn't here for all of the presentations, but I'd just like to thank everyone in the room. I think this is the first in-person event we've been able to do about such an important topic like this. And what strikes me, I think, is the theme that I've certainly brought to this debate over the last year, which is the need for men in leadership positions to show very clearly where they stand on these issues. And I think fully moving away from the idea it's up to women to keep themselves safe in any setting, whether it's the public realm debate that we're having through the public spaces work, whether it's in the nighttime economy or in a domestic setting or any other educational institutional setting, we can do a lot to support those settings to be safer and those places to be safer. But we also have to look at behaviour and the multi-generational behaviour that Catherine was presenting. Early identification is absolutely vital to what we're doing. And I think all of the thematic work that we have a joined up response to victims and survivors of abuse. And what we do know is there's that moment where survivors come forward, but there's actually a huge amount that happens before and after that moment and how we work around that. I'm sure Councillor Fajana Thomas outlined the key statistics in her opening remarks, but I was also looking at the debate that's taking place nationally today, and it's estimated that 126 UK women have been killed by men so far this year, or male perpetrator was the key agent of harm. That is a shocking set of statistics linked with the overall impact on women generationally. And then we have the names that we've marked this year, Nicole Smallman, Bieber Henry, Sarah Everard and Sabina Nessa, just to name but a few. I think all of that brings home, as well as stories in Hackney, how important this agenda is. And it isn't just one service. What I came very powerfully, I think, today is it's the voluntary and community sector, it's nighttime economy team, it's DEIS, it's the hate crime work, it's the police, it's education, it's Young Hackney. I'm going to obviously get this wrong because there'll be other people I haven't mentioned, but it's all part of that partnership effort that we must have. And we must listen and involve volunteers and activism in that too, because it isn't just about services and people providing advice, it is also about that further work. It's also clear that the conversation around public space isn't just about women keeping themselves safe. We have to be really clear in that conversation. There's the intersectionality of race, transphobia, misogyny, disability that came up a second, and intergenerational abuse. And they're all big factors in the work that we need to do. I think there's also something about behaviour change and contextual safeguarding as well. And I think you're hinting at that as well, Councillor William. Toxic cultures of masculinity in institutions that can allow behaviours to go unchecked. And that can be the police, it can be a university, it can be other places. This has been 2 years like no other in terms of this debate. And what we must make sure is that delivers meaningful change on this agenda. I will stop speaking because we're at 2 o'clock and there's been many more powerful voices than mine in the room. But I go back to my statement of the 13th of March when we were recognising Sarah Everard's murder. We need to make sure that the behaviour of men changes, that we educate each other and we actually deliver the change that women have been campaigning for. And these voices have been long and they've not been heard, whether it's about race or whether it's about violence against women and girls. And we must make sure everyone in this room, I hope, reflects on that through the 16 days of activism and delivers that meaningful change in Hackney, our organisations and beyond. Thank you. And what an incredible panel. and voices in the room as well, because I don't take away from that.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having me. Thank you very
Yes,
much.
please don't forget to share the